Hi there. My name's Tammy, and I'm excited to be here today to speak to you about site reliability engineering for Kubernetes. So I'm a principal SRE and I work at Gremlin. And yeah, let's do this. I'm really excited to share some interesting stories. And I also really want to share some interesting things that I've learned about how Kubernetes can fail. So you can find me on Twitter at Bryant, Butow, and let's get started. So there's a lot of different things that can go wrong when you're running Kubernetes in production, in staging, in different environments. So this, will happen if you're running one cluster or if you're running hundreds of clusters. I've seen a wide range of scale in terms of people running different scales of Kubernetes. Here are some questions to ask yourself. What changes when you're responsible for Kubernetes clusters? What metrics matter for K8s? What kind of incidents are common with K8s? And what should I avoid running on K8s? So the first question, what changes when you're responsible for Kubernetes clusters? In particular, this is important to think about if you're moving from, say, monolith to microservices, distributed systems, and there's just a whole lot of different things that you need to be thinking about if you're an SRE and you're running Kubernetes. The other thing to think about is how are you running it? Are you running it because you built it yourself from scratch? Are you running your own instances, your own host, your own servers in the cloud, on-prem, or are you using a managed Kubernetes service? You'll see failure modes across all of these, and that's what I want to dig into with you today. The other thing that's interesting to think about is what metrics matter for K8s. There's a whole bunch of different things to take into consideration, like pods, different types of limits for pods, resources for pods, how quick pods go down, come back up, how you load balance across machines, all these different things that you need to dig into and think through. But that's the sort of stuff that you can sit down, you can plan it out, and you can figure it out. But it's much better to do it proactively ahead of time if you can, before a big migration. If you're already there, that's okay too. We just have to get in there and make some improvements. And I'm going to go into detail today to share what kind of incidents are common with K8s. And just an interesting thing to think about is what should I avoid running on K8s? Not everything is recommended to be running on K8s. So just have a think about that. Do you feel comfortable running stateless services? Probably yes. What about stateful services? Maybe a little bit less comfortable. There's this really great repo from H. Jacobs called Kubernetes Failure Stories. So I definitely recommend checking that out. There's a lot of really interesting stories that have been collected. So you can actually dig through those and learn about them. So I'm sure you've probably seen horror stories at conferences, folks sharing different things that have gone wrong, or maybe you've seen them on Twitter. Today, what I want to do is show all of these together in one collection. Because to me, that's a really good way to learn as an SRE is let's take a step back and just understand what's happened to everybody before we make a plan going forward. And I also really love metrics. So I was excited to be able to just dig into those metrics and understand what's happened in the past. So these are the common failure modes for Kubernetes in production. You can see here what I've done is I've got all of the data from previously reported Kubernetes outages, and I actually bucketed them by type. So for example, you can see that black hole and CPU are two of the biggest ones that have issues. This is 25% and 25%. So 50% of all issues are black hole and CPU. Now, when we look at the next most common, it's going to be shutdown, 15.9%, then DNS, 13.6%, lots of DNS issues, pretty common as well. And then latency, 11.4%, and then a few others. So is this surprising to you? Did you think that, CPU issues would cause a large number of failure modes in Kubernetes when you're running it in production? What about black hole? And by black hole, what that means is something went away, something was unavailable, something disappeared. Say you were trying to talk to a service and it just disappeared for a period of time. Could be a blip, could be a few seconds, could be a few minutes, and then it came back. And it's kind of the more mysterious side of computer science. So when we think about Kubernetes and the different failure modes there, it's interesting, right, to think about that, like, CPU. There's so many different ways that you can have CPU issues impact your customers and your systems. So one of the interesting things here was, this is actually an illustration that my friend Emily made for me, and it showcases a really famous outage that happened for Target. So Target runs, huge, massive scale of Kubernetes infrastructure, one of the largest in the world. They spoke about it at KubeCon. And one of the things that they noticed was that the Kubernetes scheduler was not evenly balancing nodes. So they had this big outage where it was related to Kafka pods, and suddenly they spun up, they had some failures that they noticed. Then automatically it spun up a whole bunch of new Kafka nodes, but then there was too much CPU being consumed. Then all these nodes started to crash and they were being taken down, they were being replaced. New machines were spinning up. So they ended up spinning up thousands of new machines just during this outage, which is a lot of resources being created. And that in itself is a really interesting story. And it's just based on CPU, load balancing, and being able to manage healthy nodes. Because what happens if you do have something suddenly spike and then all these new pods are spinning up and they're taking new resources? How will Kubernetes handle that? They found out the hard way. So now what I thought would be interesting to do is to actually break down Kubernetes failures by cloud provider. So you'll see here, what I did first is look at how many outages were reported across cloud providers. So AWS is the most common to have reported outages. This makes a lot of sense, right? Because actually most people are running Kubernetes on AWS at this time. It's very, very popular cloud provider, obviously. The next most common was GKE. Google created Kubernetes originally and open sourced it. So they have their specific managed service GKE. And then the next is on-prem and Azure, which were even. So less popular, but actually I'm seeing a lot more people now moving to Azure and using their managed AKS service, but still not too many reported outages there. After that, I was like, okay, there's a lot of reported outages on AWS, and a lot of these actually are for people running Kubernetes themselves, but then also folks using EKS. So it's interesting when you just take the AWS outage data and look at that. You can see it's different, right? It's similar to the previous data that we looked at for all outages related to Kubernetes, but actually CPU is even higher. Instead of it being 25%, you can see that CPU is actually now 32% of issues when running Kubernetes on AWS. And then next most common is black hole at 28. Latency is also higher. Instead of it being around 11%, it's actually 16%. DNS at 12. And then we have a lot smaller amounts for shutdown, disk, and memory. So the reason to look into this data is to really understand it and think through it. And the next thing that I thought would be interesting to do is, let's actually break that down. Looking at the CPU specific outages, what were they? And I could actually bucket them into 3 buckets. So the first one was high CPU. So that is, related to what I spoke about earlier with that really famous Target outage. So high CPU, suddenly you get a massive CPU spike, and then maybe nodes start being taken away, pods are saying, I don't have enough CPU, I need to spin up more pods. This can also be related to the third bucket, auto scaling via CPU. So there's also a lot of outages that happen because of auto scaling via CPU. And this can be a number of different reasons, like why this is happening. For example, could be just that the configuration wasn't set up correctly. Maybe it was too sensitive. Maybe it wasn't sensitive enough. You can go in there and actually modify those settings when you're using auto scaling. And it really is not hard to do, but it's also not super configurable. There's not that many options that you can do. So I definitely recommend if you're using auto scaling, spend a few days just really, really diving into auto scaling, how it works, commonly reported issues related to auto scaling, what are the different failure modes for auto scaling, what bites people the most. Are you correctly monitoring when auto scaling kicks in and actually happens? Or are you just seeing, okay, we've got more machines, but do you see that? Do you know that that's even happening? That's the biggest thing that I always want to know, is that I know what's going on with my system. Why did it auto scale? When did it auto scale? How frequently does auto scaling happening? How long does it take for it to go back down and to scale down? I remember this super famous outage, which was a long while ago now, when I was living in San Francisco. And I think it was maybe back in probably 2016, something like that. I was working at Dropbox as a site reliability engineering manager, and I went to a meetup. And I think it was for a website that enables you to create memes. And so they were they get lots of traffic, especially on specific days. And I think this was a Halloween outage, and they had turned on auto scaling for actually DynamoDB. So what happened then is they were getting tons of traffic through all of their systems. They scaled up, and then everything seemed okay. But what they realized then was they actually couldn't scale back down afterwards. So they were paying also heaps of money because they were scaled up. And then they were like, wow, we're going to have to do a lot of work to be able to scale back down. If you go above a certain amount with DynamoDB, at that time, you couldn't scale back easily. So there's a lot of different things that can really bite you that you need to, think about and be careful about. Don't just assume that everything's going to work perfectly, because it really won't. Alrighty. So the next thing is CPU throttling. So this was also something that caused a lot of outages, just throttling limits, kind of think about it like rate limiting, but CPU throttling. Alrighty. So now let's look at the common failure modes for Kubernetes on GCP. So this is really different, right? It looks super different to our AWS graph. You can see here the most common is black hole. So when things are unavailable, when they just disappear for a few seconds, for a few minutes. And then shutdown was the next most common. So this is really different because with AWS, shutdown was tiny percent. And less than 10%, but here it's 33.3%, latency 11%, and DNS also around 11%. So those are some different types of failure modes that you should think about when you're using Kubernetes on GCP, GKE in particular. And I think this is something that with Kubernetes, everyone just thinks, oh yeah, maybe if I shut down a pod, it'll just come back smoothly. But you got to test that to make sure that you set up everything correctly, that it would actually do that. Because the underlying infrastructure, how Kubernetes works, it'll do that. But what happens if you set up something incorrectly? What if your application doesn't support that well? What happens if there's just some type of configuration issue or a problem? And so you won't really know until it's crunch time when it really matters. So it's always better to test this in advance and make sure that you're good if a node shuts down, if a container within a node shuts down, if a container within a pod, shuts down, if a pod shuts down. Lots of different things there. There's a lot of different layers of abstraction. And then when we look at Azure, this is a graph. So it's just 100% shutdown related outages on Azure, which is really interesting. And so when you're thinking about Kubernetes too, think about it in terms of how many nodes are you going to run per cluster? Are you going to run 3? Are you going to run more than 3? You're going to run only 2? That's not very many. And then also, are you going to be multi-region? Are you going to enable yourself to have clusters across different regions, or are you just going to be within one region And those are really important things to think about in terms of making sure that you're more reliable, to be able to make sure you can always serve traffic. If, like, for example, a region goes down, are your customers still able to be served? So now we've gone through that, we can see, like, actually, yeah, there's like quite a lot of different things that can go wrong. So Emily drew me this diagram of Kubernetes, but like all of the different things that might not work well for you. You know, you can definitely make sure that things do work better, but a lot of it's about checking things, auditing everything, your settings, your configuration. You know, think about the term configuration as code, making sure that you've really looked into the details of everything, including like auto scaling, CPU limits, resource limits, making sure that you know what happens if, you know, part of your infrastructure actually shuts down. Is everything okay? Does it come back cleanly? Does it come back as fast as possible? I've worked on a lot of outages that were actually like shutdown related, but due to them being ungraceful. So like really slow shutdowns that take super long time, and you have like connections hanging, and this causes a lot of problems. The next thing I recommend doing is creating a reliability plan. So this is my diagram for how to do that. So think through who, why, what, when, and how. But also, like, when you're creating your pyramid, at the bottom, I like to have tactics. So this is like all the tactical stuff that we need to do. And this usually actually does take a lot of the time and the effort. So it's like, we need to make this specific change to our auto scaling. We need to make this specific change to our resource limits for our pod definitions. Now, what are your strategic goals? So, you know, what do you actually want your cluster to operate like? How reliable do you want it to be? Are you looking to be able to have like region failover occur for your clusters? Do you want to make sure that teams can quickly and easily spin up a new cluster for themselves? How are you going to make sure that everyone gets a really great service? What's your monitoring and alerting going to look like? So these are your strategic goals, and think about that as well as like SLOs and SLIs. Now, think about above that, your mission. So I like to think about this too when you're creating something for other folks to use, especially like, you know, internally, yes, developers, but also externally, customers. Because as an SRE, like, one of the coolest things I think is a lot of the time you're working on production. And that's awesome, right? It's a huge responsibility. You're responsible for keeping production up and running and making sure that people get an amazing experience. But this to me really comes down to, what is your mission? What do you want to be able to do? And for me, with my SRE teams, I've always said like, hey, like, we want to be able to know inside ourselves that we're like super fast. Like, our mission is to be able to resolve any issues that come up quickly, simply, effectively. Like, that's our mission. And then, you know, we actually can measure that. Like, I personally would always say, I want to be able to try and aim to resolve an incident, whatever size, within 5 minutes. That requires like a lot of automation. That requires really amazing monitoring and alerting. And yeah, that's like super ambitious. And then above that, I like to have the vision and the values. You know, what are your values as a team? For me, it's like, you know, you want to be a great team that you can count on each other, and also to just be reliable yourself as a person, to be honest and call out things when they go wrong, to have integrity. So these are the types of things where, for example, if I'm the primary on call, I'm the primary. I'm going to take it serious. I'm going to make sure that I'm available. If I'm not going to be available, I'm going to tell people in advance, and I'm going to try and switch my shift with others. It's just a lot of really important details that come into being an SRE. And I think it goes up to, you know, really like, what are your values? And this is something, you know, that we don't talk about a lot of the time, but values as a team is really important. Like, for example, would you want someone in your team who, you know, they get a page, they're the primary, they act the pages, don't even look at anything, and just like go back to sleep in the middle of the night? Like, that's not good in terms of values. Like, that's not someone that I would want on my team. I would want people that I can trust. And then the other thing too is like, say if someone does something wrong, really important is that they're honest. They can just say, hey, look, I accidentally made this change. I need to roll it back. Or can you help me fix this? I think I did something wrong. Or I'm not sure if I did this correctly. Can you just like double check it for me? Like, that's awesome. Folks who are just honest and open with their communication, and they want to learn and grow. Like that's what I think makes a really great SRE, or just personally, that's what I really like. When I've, worked with so many amazing SREs over the years, that's what I really value. It's interesting that I think our job actually can make us very reliable ourselves. Alrighty. So something that I did too, they're saying like too long didn't read, so maybe like too short wanna read. You can actually read all about this on Medium. I wrote up a blog post which has like way more detail on everything that I've talked about here. So totally feel free to go in and like read through that. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Just shoot me a message on Twitter, a DM. I'm happy to answer, or add me on LinkedIn. The other thing too, if you want some hands-on practical experience learning more about Kubernetes and how to monitor Kubernetes, how to do alerting, how to inject failure, learn from that failure, be ready to run Kubernetes at scale in production, like I recommend you come along to one of the Gremlin boot camps. So this is a really cool like hands-on way to learn more about Kubernetes, and it's free. So just check that out. The other thing too is we actually wrote a tutorial where you can, I wrote this up, it shows you how to spin up your own Kubernetes cluster from scratch. So that's actually a pretty fun thing to do if you want to learn about everything inside Kubernetes, how everything runs. Spin up your own cluster from scratch instead of using a managed service, just to try it out to learn more. And if you would like stickers, go to gremlin.com/talk/SRE and we'll mail you out these really awesome stickers. All right, thank you so much. And you can find me on Twitter, Bryant Butow. I've really enjoyed being here today to speak with you today. And I hope you have an amazing conference. I really hope you have a great time. I hope that you've learned something new and interesting. And see you later. Have a great day. Bye. Awesome.
Thank you. That was a great talk and super cute illustrations. I love the slides. Thank you so much, Tammy.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks for coming along to my talk. And I'm happy to take a few questions if you want to drop anything into the chat. So I saw I tried to share also the links with everybody, so you'd be able to grab those. So those are in the chat already. I saw I had a few questions for that. And happy to take any questions. Yep.
I think you were pretty much on top of everything, so I'm not sure if we actually had any other questions that are still left. But yeah, we have a little bit of delay, so I don't think there's No, I think one of the biggest questions people were having is like, what is it? What the fuck is a black hole?
Yeah, it's like actually one of the most interesting and mysterious forms of failure that you'll see in a system. So, sometimes things are really easy to understand, right? Like CPU failure. You'll see CPU spike, you'll see it drop, like that can cause all sorts of issues, especially because a lot of the time auto scaling is triggered by CPU. But then what's a black hole? A black hole is when something just disappears, it vanishes. It's kind of like the idea in space, right, where you're like, what is going on? Like, event
horizon, everything gets sucked in.
Mm-hmm. Like, can you see a black hole? You know what I mean? Like, it's just this super mysterious thing, and it happens all the time. So a lot of the time, like I was talking to some folks at Twilio, and they would always see outages where it was like this black hole, suddenly something was unavailable. And so trying to debug it is really hard. And a lot of the time you can't even put your finger on like what actually happened in this situation. But the best way to reproduce that type of issue is to actually just make a service or a dependency upstream, downstream. You just make it unavailable. And that really enables you to figure out how you could do something like failover. So if this dependency is no longer there, if it vanishes for a few minutes, for a few hours, for a few seconds, like what do we do? Do we lose data? Like, do we lose transactions? It's like a really important thing to think about. Are we able to like replay those? Like what actually happens if something just disappears for a blip? So yeah, I find it to be one of the coolest things. I'm actually going to be giving a talk on just black holes at CraftConf in a few weeks. So I'm really excited to like share tons more detail there.
Do you have a link for that? Can you drop it in the chat or something?
Yeah, sure. I can totally do that. I'll just grab that now.
And while you're doing that, we did get another question do you have a link to any of your findings in comparing cloud providers and their implementations, limitations, and differences? The person anonymous says they're a noob, so they're apologizing if it's everywhere.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like, I'm happy to answer that. So yes, this talk is actually based on some research that I did. And so we were looking at running Kubernetes in production at Gremlin. So we wanted to do some research on Kubernetes on different cloud providers before deciding what we wanted to do. And yeah, it was cool that I got to do that as a project, but I shared all of the findings on Medium. So there is a link in the chat, which is a Medium article, if you scroll down a little bit. But yeah, that has like a massive write-up. Like, I'm a very detailed person, so I try to include everything. If you have any questions, just feel free to like leave a comment on that post and I'll answer it.
Perfect. And I think you shared your Twitter handle as well. And then people can also just DM you said, right?
Yes, for sure. Happy to do it. Yeah, and definitely don't apologize for being a noob. Like Dominique said, we were all noobs once. I started as a total noob. And I'm a noob for a lot of different things as well. Like,
that, yeah, and this is a whole other conversation. I think there's that many of us still like have imposter syndrome. Sometimes I feel like, am I doing the right thing here? But that's a whole conversation for a different day.
Yeah. Everyone, like, I like the idea of having a growth mindset. There's a book by Carol Dweck where she talks about that, but that's like super important, always be learning. I love to read books and growing, and you can learn a lot from other people. Like the book that I'm currently reading is called like Becoming Bulletproof. It's like super interesting book.
Cool.
Just pull it really close, by Evie Pomfris. And she actually was like a secret agent in the US. And she also won a medal for her work on 9/11. And she just talks a lot about like you as a person, how you can like deal with difficult situations. She talks a lot about, environments where it's hard, it's a struggle. And a lot of the work that we do when you're on call, for example, can be really stressful. But she's like, don't try and avoid stress, like use stress to make you stronger and like learn from it, but you'll grow and you'll adapt. So, it's just a journey that we're all on.
Yeah, 100%. Stress is like, it's one of those things that the human body stress is actually healthy to some degree. It will help you like be more active and like change and adapt to certain situations. And I always say life happens outside of the comfort zone. So
yeah, exactly. That's true. Like there's this cool diagram someone once showed me, which is like, this is your comfort zone, this is your learning zone, and then this is the danger zone. So you want to stay in the learning zone. You don't want to go into the danger zone. I love that diagram. It's so good.
Yeah, excellent. I love to talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think, do we have time for one more question, or do we have
I think we have time for more questions, but there's no more question.
Do you have a question, Charlotte, yourself? Because I've been like, just firing off things.
I think you shared links for getting started with different Gremlin tools, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Just go to gremlin.com/buttons. That's like one of my nicknames. You can actually use Gremlin for free. So if you want to try that out, and remember that like chaos engineering is super new. So I actually think it's a really fun area to get into. There's a lot of folks that are just starting now, and now's the perfect time to get involved. Like a lot of people are learning together. If you join our Slack, if you go to gremlin.com/Slack, there's like thousands of people in that Slack channel. I think almost 8,000 people. There's a learning channel. There's like a mentoring channel. So, if you're looking for people to work with you, it's like super cool and fun way to learn and grow together.
Awesome. We'll definitely try that out. Thank you so much, Tammy. Thanks for the talk.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. Bye.
Of course. Bye.